They told me to get out of my own house. No warning, no conversation, just leave. And I stood there, looking at everything I built, everything I sacrificed for, and I said nothing. Not because I was weak, because some battles aren't worth winning. I was never the loudest person in the room, never the one who demanded attention, who fought for recognition, or who made sure everyone knew what I was contributing. I was the one who just worked consistently. While others talked about what they were going to do, I was already doing it. That was just who I was, someone who believed that effort speaks louder than words, that loyalty means something, and that if you pour yourself into something wholeheartedly, the people around you will eventually see it. This was my home, not just a building, a life I had built from scratch. Every corner of that house carried my fingerprints. The walls I painted myself on weekends when everyone else was resting. The bills I quietly covered during the months when money was tight and no one wanted to talk about it. The repairs, the groceries, the small sacrifices that added up into years. I never kept score because I never thought I needed to. These were the people I loved. This was the place I belonged, or so I thought. The tension didn't start with one big moment. It never does. It started with small things, the kind of things you brush off the first time, explain away the second time, and go silent about the third time, because you don't want to be the person who makes everything into a problem. A dismissive comment here, a decision made without consulting me there, my opinion asked for and then immediately ignored. My presence acknowledged only when something needed to be done, and forgotten the moment it was finished. I started noticing the pattern but told myself I was being too sensitive. I told myself that relationships have rough patches. I told myself it would pass. It didn't pass. It got worse. There was a night, and I remember it clearly because it was the night something inside me quietly broke, where I had handled an entire situation that no one else wanted to deal with. I had sacrificed a full day, called in favors, spent money I hadn't planned to spend, all to fix a problem that wasn't even mine to fix. And when it was over, when everything had been handled and the crisis had passed, someone walked into the room, looked around at the result, and took credit for it, casually, confidently, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And when I opened my mouth to say something, the look I received told me everything. Don't, just don't. Your place here is to do, not to be recognized for doing. I sat down, I said nothing, but something shifted in me that night that I could not shift back. After that, the incidents came faster. Arguments I wasn't invited into but was blamed for. Conversations that stopped the moment I walked into a room. A growing feeling that I was being managed, handled, slowly pushed to the edges of my own space. And then one evening, without any real discussion, without sitting down and talking like adults, I was told to leave. Told that this wasn't working. Told that it would be better for everyone if I just went. The words were said calmly, almost casually, like the decision had been made long ago and this was just the announcement. I looked around the room, at the faces, at the home I had poured myself into, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Not rage, not tears, clarity. I picked up my keys. I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't say a single word in my defense, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had finally understood something. Defending yourself to people who have already decided your value is a waste of the only currency that actually matters, which is your energy. So I left, quietly, completely, and the silence I left behind me was louder than anything I could have screamed. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the moment I walked out that door, I didn't fall apart. I got to work. I had time now. More time than I'd had in years, because I was no longer spending it maintaining a place that had stopped valuing my presence. I redirected everything. Every hour I had been giving to people who dismissed me went into building something for myself. I started planning. I started executing. Quietly, just like always. But this time, for me, I reconnected with people who had always respected my work and wondered why I'd made myself so small for so long. I made moves I had been putting off because I had been too invested in a situation that was slowly draining me. I stopped waiting for permission and started making decisions. Slowly, then all at once, things began to change. Months passed. I didn't reach out. I didn't check in. I didn't post about what I was doing or broadcast my progress to anyone connected to that world. I just built. And when the results started to show, when what I had quietly been working on became impossible to ignore, the calls started coming in, slow C at first, then regularly. The same people who had looked through me were now looking for me. The person who had taken credit for my work was now in a situation where the work had fallen apart, without me there to hold it together. The comfortable assumption that I was replaceable had met the uncomfortable reality that I was not. I remember the first time one of them reached out. The message was careful, warm even, like no time had passed, like nothing had happened, and I sat with it for a long time. Not because I was angry. I had moved past anger somewhere in quiet months of building. I sat with it because I wanted to be intentional about how I responded. Not to punish anyone, not to gloat, but because I had learned something fundamental about myself during this entire experience, which was that I had been so focused on being needed that I had forgotten to ask whether the situation was actually good for me. The answer, looking back, was clearly no, and no amount of being wanted now could rewrite that. I responded, politely, professionally, with zero bitterness and zero eagerness. And in that response, or maybe in the version of me that had written it, I could feel the full weight of how much I had changed. The person who had walked out that door in silence had not disappeared. He had simply stopped being available to people who only recognized his value once it was gone. The home I built now looks different. It is quieter, smaller in some ways, but entirely mine. Every decision in it is mine. Every person in it chose to be there and continues to choose to be there. There is no scorekeeping, no invisible hierarchy, no feeling of being tolerated rather than valued. And on the days when I think back to that evening, the casual words, the faces, the door closing behind me, I don't feel the sting of it anymore. I feel something closer to gratitude. Because being pushed out of the wrong place was the only way I was ever going to find my way to the right one. Some people will only understand what you were worth once you are no longer there to prove it to them. That is not your failure. That is their lesson. And you are not responsible for teaching it twice. There is something nobody tells you about being pushed out of a place you built, that the pushing was never really about you. It was about what your presence cost other people. Your consistency made their inconsistency visible. Your silence made their noise uncomfortable. Your work made their laziness impossible to hide. So they removed the mirror, they called it a decision, they dressed it up as what was best for everyone. But what it really was, underneath all of that, was fear. Fear of someone who kept showing up, kept delivering, kept being undeniable without needing to announce it. And you walked away. Not because you were defeated, but because you were done spending yourself on people who had already decided your value without ever truly measuring it. Here is what that silence cost them and gave you. It cost them the one person who was holding more together than anyone had admitted. It gave you back every single hour, every ounce of energy, every piece of yourself you had been quietly feeding into a situation that was never going to feed you back. The moment you stopped pouring into the wrong place, you had everything you needed to build the right one. And you did. Not loudly, not to prove a point, but because that is simply who you are. Someone who works, who builds, who creates, regardless of who is watching. The regret on their end was never your goal. But it was inevitable, because the truth always becomes visible once the person carrying it stops carrying it for you. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Your loyalty is not a weakness to be exploited. Your silence is not an invitation to be dismissed. Your willingness to work without recognition is not a signal that you do not deserve any. And the moment a place, or a person, or a situation starts treating your presence like a convenience rather than a contribution, you are not obligated to keep showing up. Walking away with your dignity intact is not losing. It is the most deliberate, powerful form of winning there is. You do not have to argue to be right. You do not have to fight to be strong. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is simply leave, build something better, and let the results speak at a volume no argument ever could. If this story hit something in you, if you have ever been dismissed by the exact people who needed you most, if you have ever walked away from something you built with your own hands, tell me in the comments. I want to hear your story, because you are not alone in this and your experience deserves to be said out loud. If you are new here, subscribe. This channel is for people who are done being overlooked and ready to start building on their own terms. The next video is coming soon, and trust me, you will not want to miss it.